luckily, we've got Joe here and he's got things up and running. So if you're still there, say hello. And sorry about that, but hey, that's the first real solid crash we've had while doing the live stream. So we've had a fairly good run till now. Right. Anyway, let's get on. Now, free speech. And I want to talk about this and get this idea of, because I really have an issue with the Hunter Biden laptop controversy and the Trump incitement of violence and the decision by these digital platforms to cancel these people. And I think it's worth exploring. So when it comes to free speech, there's no such thing as free speech. We've always had restrictions on free speech. There's actually a lot of restrictions on free speech. So without looking anything up, I just sort of off the top of my head came up with some of the restrictions that we readily accept. So you can't say something fraudulent. You can't be misleading and deceptive in business. You can't make negligent misrepresentations. You can't defame people. You can't incite violence. In terms of confidentiality, either working for the government or maybe even in private business, you might agree to confidentiality provisions that mean you can't say things. In employment contracts, you might be prevented from promoting a competing product. You might be prevented from sullying a role model image that you might have. And in financial advice, if you don't have the necessary qualifications and licenses, you can't give financial advice. So there's a range of things that are in place to prevent free speech. But with all those sorts of things, they're kind of around the idea that, well, if you say them, here is the punishment that you might encounter, either from society or from somebody else in a contractual sense. So basically you can say these things, but you'll be in trouble if you do. And when it's come to, for us it was easy when it came to ridiculing religion or attacking Islam or something like that. We would say, well, if it's inciting violence, then you got to stop there. That's an easy line to draw. And if you cross that line of inciting violence, you should be stopped. Otherwise, just because you say something offensive, offence is really a subjective thing. You might say something that is quite true. It might be morally, substantial. Like it could be something perfectly fine to say, which will be offensive to somebody else in a subjective sense. So,
have I told you, Trevor, your hair is getting whiter by the week?
Right. Oh, I'm offended by that. Yeah. But then I could say, actually, thank you. It looks good, doesn't it? Yeah,
looks great.
It's exactly. So,
but you're right. Just being offended is not grounds to stop speech. Is it?
So that was an easy one when it came to our views on free speech. That there's an easy line to sort of more or less determine. We had a few arguments when it came to employment law. So, yes, on Israel Folau. So I took the view that if you said something that was basically affected your ability to perform your job, then an employer could say, don't say those things because you can't perform your job. And with Israel Folau, we had a bit of a talk about, well, because I was saying he was getting paid a lot of money in order to be a role model, and his statements were cancelling out that job as a potential one. So it was an argument over what really was a person's job or not. But we sort of could come to, personally anyway, I could come to an easy resolution of what could be stopped and not stopped when it comes to employment law. So all of these things focus on consequences for the individual after publication has occurred. But more recently, we've got this problem of big, powerful organisations that are refusing to publish stuff in the first place. So the one that really comes to mind is that whole Hunter Biden scenario. So the story is that he supposedly had a laptop which he put in a repair shop, which had incriminating emails on it that would be detrimental for him and for his father, the presidential candidate Joe Biden, and that these had somehow got into the hands of Rudy Giuliani. And a number of news organisations said, well, we're just not running that story. We're deciding to not run it. So
that was mainly the more liberal news media in America. They didn't want to spoil Joe's chances.
Yes.
Do you think? I mean, that's what people say.
Yeah. And they were basically saying this is damaging. They were saying this is damaging to Biden. It's unsubstantiated stuff which can't be properly investigated till after the election. So this is just potentially a heap of shit which could cost Biden votes. And if we help enable this sort of misinformation, we're part of the problem. And so we're withholding it. So, Paul, do you have a view on news organisations withholding publication of that? You don't?
I don't think they should withhold, frankly.
Right.
I think if they had a story on Joe Biden's son, they should have been free to publish it. I mean, some papers did, I think. The New York Post, published a story.
New York Post published something.
So it wasn't as if all the news media were refraining from publishing it, but some did, for sure.
Yeah, but what I heard was that they went to the Wall Street Journal and that sort of shit, and they said, well, you can't prove this. Get out of our office. They shopped around looking for someone to publish it, and they eventually found the New York Post. I don't know what that says about New York Post, but it does say that it seemed to me that the major concern of the publishers was the truth behind it, more so than how much damage it would do to Joe Biden.
So when we've got publishers, news organisations deciding we're not running a story, I don't have a problem with that because basically they're curators of their own paper and it's up to them to decide what they're going to put in their paper or not. But what about when we've got things like Facebook and Twitter deciding to ban stuff on the basis that they just don't like it from the same sort of thing?
Such as?
Let me just see what examples I had here. Well, we've got Twitter, for example, cancelling the account of people because, well, that was an inciting violence one, really. With what was the example I gave just before, where Twitter cancelled an account of
Steve Bannon.
Yes, yeah, because he called for the
heads on pikes.
Yeah, so we're okay with that because that's a clear incitement of violence.
The other thing with the Biden laptop is, given this is almost a mirror image of the email leak of Clinton just before the last election.
Right.
Whether this was foreign interference in the election.
Right.
And therefore, does the news media, if a foreign intelligence source comes to you with something that's potentially damaging to the election, do they have a responsibility to hold off and say, yes, it's in the public interest, but you're trying to manipulate the election, we'll do this afterwards, thank you?
I think if they're news organisations, it's clear they can say no to anything. But when they're platforms, it, to me, hasn't been clear on whether they can say no to anything. And if platforms are going to start curating stuff, I really think they then start to become responsible for it. So at the moment, if a news organisation republishes something that's defamatory, then they also get sued for defamation. Whereas the platforms say, well, we had nothing to do with it. It wasn't in our control. We shouldn't be liable for defamation as a result. And I think when they start curating like they are with Trump's tweets and things like that, they're really starting to fall into the side of publishers and becoming responsible for what they're producing.
Well, what they're saying on Twitter, though, they're saying you should take this with a grain of salt, which I don't think is the same as what you're saying. I can understand where you're coming from with the curating thing. And it's a different side of the story. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it now. Thank you very much, Trevor.
Right.
But I don't have a problem with what Twitter's done with Donald Trump's tweets. They've actually pointed them out and he's said, look, these could be false.
So, but then they're sort of like taking a responsibility for,
as you say, Trevor, they're curating, so they're acting as publishers, aren't they?
Yes.
And yet they maintain they're not.
Yes.
So they're trying to play it both ways, aren't they, according to what suits them.
So they're getting their hands dirty on that sort of subjective sort of thing.
And I know from Facebook friends, if I can call them that, I often see messages from people who say, oh, I've just come back from Facebook jail. You know, I said something bad about Islam or something like that, you know. So they clearly...
Or even Christianity.
Really? Yeah. So they clearly do curate some sorts of topics that they don't want published.
Yeah.
So what's Facebook jail? Is that...
Oh, you get banned for a month or something, don't you? Is that
well, it's variable time, but basically you get locked out from posting.
Yeah. So you can still read, but you can't post.
I believe so.
Is that right? Yeah. And some people even get several Facebook names or profiles so that they can continue.
So we're reaching an interesting point, though, where, you know, what happened with Trump and having those tweets either hidden or the news services actually ceasing broadcasting on the basis of this is just bullshit and we would normally publish this stuff. I don't think that's happened quite like that before. It's another... In the past, they might have gone, oh, we're not... When has it happened before? It's such a major news event that they've just said, well, actually, we're just not going to present it to you because we don't think it's good for you.
It's never happened before, but don't you think, considering the character of the person involved, that they've made a decision that this guy's a clown, he lies, so we've got to shut him up?
Yes.
Yeah, but they can't... Yeah. They can't make that sort of judgment about everybody, you know. They can't just say, oh, this guy's a clown, and therefore we're going to shut him down.
But with Donald Trump, he is a public figure.
Well, we think
has been shown to be a liar repeatedly. So I don't have a problem with them making a judgment call and saying, we've got to shut him up.
So the reasons are these are lies and these are dangerous.
Exactly.
But then if you're going to do that, you then have to apply it consistently. Otherwise, you're discriminating against people. So
they can discriminate against Angela Merkel. They can discriminate against Boris Johnson. They can discriminate against Jacinda Ardern. They can discriminate against Scott Morrison. They can discriminate against people that are public figures, and that would make them a little bit more work, but not dramatically work. If you're going to have them apply it across to their billions of users or millions of users or whatever it is, then that's going to become an incredible burden for them.
Yeah. So what if somebody says, okay, you've allowed this anti-vaxxer to climate change. Like, here's a well-known Republican senator or whatever who's said these false statements about climate change, which are dangerous to the community. Now you've deplatformed Donald Trump on that same issue. Why are you doing it? Why aren't you doing it on this issue?
Well, I think they should do that because they're both public figures.
And they didn't deplatform him. They merely put warning notices in front of his...
Exactly.
Well, the news services, though, said we're going to stop broadcasting.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so...
Well, the news services said they're going to stop broadcasting because it's lies.
I clearly don't have my argument very well structured, and in my defence, our computer crashing before threw me off. So I'm going to revisit this topic at another time when I can get my mind around it better. But...
maybe you need to drink more beers.
Yeah.
Is it worth touching on France and Islam at the same time?
Sure.
With the freedom of speech?
Yeah. So, to be honest, I haven't kept up much with what happened in France with there was a couple of beheadings and...
No, it was a beheading and some stabbings.
Yes. And in terms of freedom of speech, it was basically Muslims saying you can't talk about Islam like
So initially it was a teacher in a civics class in school showed the cartoons of Muhammad that had got the Charlie Hebdo murders started. There was some playground gossip. one of the parents posted on social media about it, and a Chechen immigrant who was also a Muslim decided that he took offence to that and went in and killed the teacher and cut his head off.
And the teacher had warned the kids and said, I'm about to speak about this and you can leave if you need to.
You can basically look away if you're going to be offended.
Yes, yeah.
But what happened in the classroom, so the police came to interview him because a number of the parents complained. And his interview said, actually, no, I treated this respectfully. I told the children, because he was accused of having kicked the Muslims out of the class. And he said, no, just look away if you're going to be offended. We need to discuss this. So there's a lot of he said, she said, but it sounds like the child whose father complained wasn't even in the classroom at the time.
Yes.
Had misheard things or had heard things misreported in the playground and had made up this story. And it got conflated and blew up and ended up with a teacher getting murdered.
But the French are still pretty strong on, well,
secularism.
Everything he did was fine and he should be able to do that.
So
they haven't backed down on the teacher's ability to do that.
Some town halls have actually been projecting cartoons of Muhammad on the side of the town halls.
Right.
In solidarity.
Right.
However, there was an Al Jazeera article saying that this is fundamentally wrong and that the French should no way show pictures of Muhammad because it's insulting to all Muslims and they're being Islamophobic by showing pictures of cartoons of Muhammad.
And that article, and thanks for sharing, Joe, that in that article, the writer was clearly an Islamist himself, and he was mischaracterizing secular liberalism.
Well, I thought it was very interesting, the article that Joe sent. Or was it you sent it? I forget which one of you sent it.
Joe sent it to us.
Well, did you send the one that said that 58% of Muslim youth agreed that Sharia law was better than... It was Paul, was it?
Oh, yeah. That was mine, yeah.
That he said that 58% of Muslim youth agreed that Sharia law was preferable to French law.
Not preferable, takes
precedence
over French law.
It's really very, very frightening when you got a percentage like that.
Absolutely, it's frightening.
And France has actually said we've got a big problem with the way that Islam is being taught in our mosques and in our schools, and was calling for a Francophone or Francification, a French Islam.
Right. Well, the teachers had to have been French raised Islamic teachers, is that right?
It was basically that the imams should be trained in a French school.
And stop importing them.
And stop importing Wahhabi trained.
So the government came out and said that?
Yes.
Right. Yep.
And they've started instituting it as well. It's not just words.
Yeah.
And then, of course, just a few days ago, there were those... how many were killed in Austria?
There was at least
in
one,
Vienna.
Wasn't there?
I think there were several. There were 3 or 4 people were shot by, they say now, a lone gunman who was then shot dead by police, I think. And so I think a few leaders of European countries will be consulting each other and trying to formulate some sort of cohesive strategy between them, because it's just coming to a head, isn't it? I mean, they're really fed up. The French are really fed up. And my friend Mark, who came on the program once, he follows the French and German news. He reads both French and German, so he reads the news regularly of those 2 countries. And he said to me recently, the French are really fed up, and people from polls that were published, he said a lot of people in France are really, really fed up and they want something done about it.
And that's why Le Pen was doing so well in elections.
That's right. Le Pen, Mark was saying he thinks Le Pen will do even better at the next election as a result.
The only people who got themselves to blame for that is the Muslims.
Well, it's more complicated than that, though, because, I mean, I
don't think it is any more complicated than that.
Well, even Macron, to his credit, he said, look, part of the problem is...
Well, crazy Islamic leaders are to blame.
Yeah. But Macron said, basically, the French state has not done enough to integrate Muslim immigrants into mainstream French society. They've been allowed to form these little parallel societies, parallel communities in the major cities, and he has a point.
And therefore disaffected youth have been ripe for radicalisation.
Yes, exactly. So it is a relatively complex sociological phenomenon, but clearly they've got a big problem. And they're going to have to do something.
Well, Germany's got a big problem too.
Absolutely.
England's got a big problem too.
Britain's got a big problem.
The whole of Western Europe. The Eastern Europeans didn't accept very many of the migrants in 2015, so it's less of an issue in in the Eastern European countries. But France, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, the UK. I don't know about Spain. They have a fairly sizable Muslim community too, as does Italy.
The UK, it was the Pakistanis. You listen to Majid Nawaz, who is London, I think, born and raised. Oh, sorry, Essex, he said, who was a teenager in the 90s as the Balkan Wars kicked off. And he said in his mosque he was hearing that it was a genocide against the Muslims, and that the Europeans were doing nothing against it, and he was recruited, and he joined an Islamist but not a jihadist group.
I forget the name. There's a branch in Australia too, Tahrir something, isn't it? What is it?
Yeah, I forget. Anyway, he ended up in Egypt and was imprisoned in Egypt for being a member of a banned group.
Yes.
And it was there that people reached out to him and deconverted him. And he's now a moderate.
Yeah. Well, the problem was around that time as well in the UK, they basically encouraged identity, and leaders of ethnic groups were given money and power by local governments, and people were encouraged to live sort of parallel lives rather than integrated lives. And doesn't matter who you are. If you're running parallel communities where people don't integrate, you are going to have problems. And unfortunately, that's what happens with this hardline Islamism.
We got that from that, what's his name?
Kenan Malik.
That's it, Kenan Malik. Yeah. He wrote about that quite extensively.
It's like I've said millions of times before, I'll say it again, assimilation is not a dirty word.
Not at all.
It's one of those things that we should be striving for.
So that's one of the triumphs of Australia, is that to a large extent, the ethnic communities have, to a large extent, when we talk originally about the Italians and the Greeks, great social successes.
The post-war migration, they integrated within a generation. They were integrated, weren't they? I mean, all their children were just Aussies.
And then the Vietnamese. Yeah, after that,
they're pretty well integrated.
Yes,
I as you know, I know some Vietnamese family quite well, and their children are just Aussies.
Yes, and second generation ends up marrying an Aussie and all the rest of it.
That's right.
But it's encouraged under Islam to lead a separate life. You can only marry a Muslim, and unfortunately, our leaders have encouraged multiculturalism as this sort of separate identity.
And Morrison hasn't helped much, has he? Because he's taken the line that they're entitled to follow their religious beliefs. This kind of line. I mean, he would draw the line at inciting violence, obviously, but
they are entitled to follow their religious beliefs, but they've got to stop preaching this nonsense about you've got to behead people and all that sort of shit. That has to go.
But the point Trevor made is an interesting one, where they generally don't marry out of the religious
that is
community.
A real
I encountered that in when I was a high school teacher, and I had some Muslim students. Obviously, I was at a fairly multicultural state high school, and they generally are pretty multicultural these days. But I had several senior, like year 11, 12 girls from Muslim families, and I remember one conversation where they were talking about their parents choosing marriage partners for them, and I didn't criticise it, but I said, "How do you feel about that?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's fine with us."
I've had lots of conversations with Uber drivers with that same thing. Surprising number of male Uber drivers who are here studying or whatever and are still single, and their parents back home are organising their spouse for them. And they're quite content with it.
I had a colleague at work who disappeared off back to India
Yep.
For holidays to see his family and rang up the boss while he was there and said, I need an extra week, I'm getting married.
Yes.
Yeah. The Indian community, actually, not only the Muslim Indian community, but the Hindu Indian community are quite against marrying out of the religious community as well. Often.
Yeah.
Not always, of course, but often. Oh, there was one more girl who was a student of mine, and I saw her several years after she'd been my student. I saw her on a public bus, and she was headscarfed. And she spoke to me, and I said, "Oh, how are things these days?" And she, from a conversation, I understood that she'd become increasingly an increasingly observant Muslim, and she said something about wanting to go back to Iran, which is where her family were from.
It's a big problem, and I don't think there's any solving it for Europe, because the populations are so large that they can create these enclaves now where they don't need to integrate.
Approaching 20%, isn't it, in France?
I didn't think it was that much, but
it'd be well into the sort of 10 to 15%.
I think it's around 10, but yes.
Yeah.
In the chat room, Matthew has made comments about Majid Nawaz. That guy, I agree, Matthew, he has gone
off the deep
crazy. He's all sort of funny pro-Trump, but he speaks in riddles, and he is losing it in a big way. Yeah, so
Majid Nawaz is.
Yeah, Majid Nawaz.
It's interesting because he was very, very centrist historically.
Yeah, but there's something really odd going on with him.
I think he's just a little concerned, like a lot of other people, about the...
Have you been reading much of him lately?
No, not much, but I've seen bits and pieces. But I think he's just really against the left wing of the Democratic Party. I don't know, maybe I should read him a bit more, but that was the impression I had.
It's funny stuff.
I don't think he really liked Trump. I think he just didn't like the direction the Democratic Party was going
in. Just harking back, to finish off on sort of post-Trump stuff, and I, of course, have been watching the Sky News Facebook page and catching a bit of that, and also a little bit
Thank you for your support, Trevor.
Yeah. So if you think what's happening in America couldn't happen here, think again. The pro-Trumpness that is around is scary and is significant. So it could easily happen here. So first of all, here's a little bit of Rowan Dean for you. I'll just play this. Headphones on.
I never thought I would see an attempted political coup in the greatest democracy on earth, the USA. Yet increasingly, that is what it is looking like. There clearly was fraud on the night of the election, both electronically and physically, with all the rorting going in Biden's direction. A stolen election.
Sky News is harder pro-Trump than Fox News in America.
Is that Sky News After Dark? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
It's so pro-Trump. It's incredible. It's actually harder than Fox News. And Alan Jones, Rowan Dean, all those characters. Paul, you're shaking your head a little bit? No?
Rowan Dean, I don't know why he's going on like that. He sounds a bit loopy, doesn't he?
He does sound a bit
He's
loopy.
a complete nut.
Yeah. So
it's interesting because they're saying that everyone predicted that the in-person votes would be counted first and would give Trump a huge lead, and then that would ebb away as the postal and drop-off votes were counted later on. So this is nothing unpredicted.
Yep.
And so how you can take that to be corruption?
Yeah, well, the one guy on Sky After Dark who made some sense was Andrew Bolt. And he said, Sky News host Andrew Bolt said he hopes Donald Trump will stop recklessly claiming he's been beaten out of a win because I can't see any evidence of fraud and democracy must win. So
wouldn't you like to see a debate between Rowan Dean and Andrew Bolt on the issue?
No. So Andrew Bolt has come out with something sensible, right?
He does have these moments, yeah.
Right. But if you then look at on where he's posted that on, where that's posted on Facebook, my God, all of his followers have just gone apeshit over it. So
Whose followers? Bolt's
Andrew
followers?
Bolt's followers. So basically everybody slammed him. So Maureen says, "You have missed the mark, Andrew. You mightn't like Trump. It has stood for the people and he made worldwide differences for the good. And you can bet your last dollar on it that the Democrats have been up to no good. Just look at how Trump has had to go through all their Mueller investigation, costing their country millions. No other man could have endured the stress. No wonder he was abrasive in manner. Read between the lines, Andrew, and open your observation skills to the truth. Andrew, you're not on the take from Soros, ?
Oh, for God's sake.
263 people like that. Jan says, I couldn't watch Bolt tonight. Thinks he knows it all. Of course, people have a right to be concerned of how he was so far ahead, yet now so far behind. Alan Jones sums it up pretty well.
What did Alan Jones say?
Basically, it's fraud.
Really?
Yes, and that perhaps Trump was even understating the amount of fraud.
Wow.
And that he's been around a long time. So 225 agreed with Jan. Laurette, Andrew, I normally enjoy listening and agreeing with you on several matters, but today you're way off the mark. Pretty disappointing. 403 agree with that. Biggest election fraud going in the USA. I'm surprised you're sweeping it under the rug, Andrew, like the Dems did with the Biden corruption. 578 agree with that one.
Andrew must be on the take.
Lead him as a Democrat, I would want. I'll leave that one. That one was basically a Democrat saying, I'd still want this checked out. Becca says, Andrew Bolt said that. Is he having conniptions? I guess even a broken watch is right twice a day. 50 likes. And that was the only positive comment. Literally, as I was scrolling down, I got beyond 50. They were all, how dare you, Andrew Bolt, say this from his own followers. So things like, I don't mind losing any fairly played game, but I sure as hell hate being cheated. Dude, there's a fraud happening in every swing state. Wow, Bolt, that's a disappointing stance. There's mountains of evidence of election tampering. Way off on this one, Bolt. Can't see fraud? Really? Very surprised you are getting this one so wrong. Like endless comments with hundreds of people sort of confirming these comments.
Don't you think that the simple answer to that is, where that guy said, there's been hundreds of cases of fraud. Name them. Tell me at a specific instance of the fraud. Oh, well, I heard, it's a load of shit.
Well, these people say, I've seen hundreds of cases on social media, is what they say. Mainstream media won't tell you. You have to look elsewhere. These are the sorts of comments that are coming through there. Like, it's seriously frightening. And the number of people on that Sky News Facebook page who are totally into this nonsense, who are Australians who should know better. I'm scared by it.
But when you say you think it could happen here, in my mind, I think Pauline Hanson is about the closest that we would have to someone like Bolt.
And look how well she did in the state election.
Well, exactly. Terribly. She didn't win. I think they won one seat in Queensland, didn't they?
It was 5% of the vote.
My point is, we look at the US election and these allegations of fraud and we go completely nuts. And I look at it and think, how could anybody accept this nutty situation? Okay, Americans are subjected to a lot of propaganda. I guess if you're just tuned into Fox News all day, you could be brainwashed into thinking it. But I just look at these Australian commentators and I think, you've got no excuse for this. Like, it frightens me that Australians could fall for this. So if a similar sort of demagogue came out and said Australia's elections are rigged, then you could get a surprising number of people could agree, which would be worrying.
Mr. P, like
Right.
Mr. P.
Mr. P?
Mr. P. I don't want to say his name because he's very litigious.
Oh, okay. Well,
The yellow man.
yeah.
I mean, he's cashed up
Yeah.
like Donald Trump, sort of,
Yeah.
and has sort of similar, very ultra-conservative ideas, doesn't he?
Yeah, well,
Doesn't like taxes, doesn't like constraints on business.
if if a crazy guy got in charge of the Liberals and lost an election and claimed election fraud, all I'm saying is don't be surprised about how many people suddenly agree with the idea because they're agreeing with it here.
Don't forget, even if it's 1% of people are crazy nutters, in Australia, that's still 200,000 people.
Yes.
That's a lot of likes on Facebook.
Yes.
So
this is exaggerating it, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Right.
So you can have a very noisy minority that's a tiny fraction. Just because of the size of the population, it seems like a lot of people.
Right. Yep.
So I wouldn't be overly concerned that these nutbags are going to take control because I think there are relatively small numbers of them.
I agree.
I don't know. I just think Sky News at this point has a relatively small reach, but they've got a really rabid following from what I've seen there. And give them time in another 10 years, who knows what damage they could do. So
don't let them breathe.
That's all right. Kev's going to sort that out.
News about a vaccine. So drug company Pfizer has announced that early trials of a vaccine candidate suggest it may be 90% effective at preventing COVID-19. Based on 94 confirmed cases in a study that has enrolled 43,000 participants across the US and 5 other countries. So it's a very promising drug that Pfizer has developed. So
I think that's 90% effective at presenting the disease COVID-19. It does not stop you being infected with COVID-19, but it stops you developing any of the symptoms.
I don't know.
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well,
this is the first generation of vaccines.
is that how vaccines normally work? That you still get the
No.
right? So you'll
But the
get it, but
first-
you won't feel the symptoms.
Exactly.
Really?
I saw a
This is the first generation vaccine. This is what they're all going to do.
Mm.
Is they're going to stop you getting sick. But the next generation, or the second or third generation, will actually stop the transmission of the disease.
I saw a graphic this afternoon on TV, and they said it contained, is it proteins that they're synthetic. It's not derived from the actual virus itself, and it gives your cells some sort of defensive mechanism that stops the virus attaching itself and infecting the cells.
Basically, your immune system consists. There's the innate immune system, and then something else that basically learns. And what it does is it learns what the virus looks like. And what they can do is train it by giving it a small part of the virus, but not the entire virus. So it looks for a marker that the virus contains. And in fact, what they're saying is they're not even giving it that. They're giving a precursor that your body then converts into the protein that the virus contains, and your body creates the vaccine inside itself. It's very smart, and they've been working on this for a number of years. I would listen to somebody talking about it on the grounds that they would have to ramp up this technology very quickly. They've been expecting a pandemic for a while. They're going, we know it's going to happen, we just don't know which virus. We need the processes in place to be able to ramp up vaccine production very, very quickly.
Is this the Pfizer vaccine or not?
Not sure which one this was.
Yeah.
I'll dig out it may be a private video. It might have been shared on one of my...
Yeah, it's all right. It's just that sounds different to what I've heard, because I heard...
Yeah, there are a number of vaccines, and they work in different ways.
I just heard that this is from Norman Swan anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, he said that your first generation vaccines, all they do is they prevent the disease. They don't stop you catching it. So that was what I was concerned about, was that, it doesn't actually stop the spread of the disease. It just stops the disease actually forming in you.
I heard this afternoon that they said it does stop you transmitting the disease to somebody else.
Okay, maybe it does. I couldn't do it.
I don't understand it well either. But
Anyway, sounds relatively positive.
It is very positive. You're getting 90% and that sort of stuff. That's very effective.
Maybe this time next year we could have an effective vaccine of some sort, potentially.
The problem is going to be how we ramp up production. And so the initial doses will go to those most at risk, the healthcare workers, those in aged care facilities, and will be slowly rolled out across the population.
Yeah, maybe in 18 months' time, we'll have something. It's looking more and more positive.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm getting at here, Paul, is when we're talking about shutdowns and lockdowns, and you said that we're basically going to be eating humble pie. If you look at the screen there, I've got a picture of some humble pie.
Oh, you're getting ready.
That we'll be eating. That's right.
Good on you.
And you said, you guys will be eating some humble pie. And what I thought was, how will we know when it's time for either of us to eat humble pie on lockdowns? It's a very difficult thing to
We won't.
Yes.
And obviously, as soon as I said that, I thought, nah, you're never going to eat humble pie. Because there will be nothing that will change your mind that the course of events weren't the correct ones to follow.
Right.
And
vice versa.
conversely, yes, there will be nothing that will change my mind that lockdown was a big mistake.
Yes. So, because really what we're looking at is a calculation of human flourishing,
Or lack thereof.
Indeed, under lockdown versus what it would have been had we not had a lockdown but were still subjected to a pandemic. So we'll never know exactly what human flourishing trade-offs have occurred in that. And anybody who attempts to do a calculation scientifically is probably just pulling figures out of their ass, you would think. So, but what I did think was that, what if in 2 or 4 or 6 years' time, they sort of surveyed the Queensland population and said, hey, remember 2020 and we did that lockdown? Do you think it was a good idea or not? Then each person would basically do their own calculation of their life circumstances and go, well, I did okay or I didn't do okay. It was either a good idea for me or a bad idea for me. And that would be a way of sort of, if in 6 years' time, were you around in 2020? Did you go through all that process? Do you think the lockdown was a good idea or not? If 75% of Queenslanders said, yeah, it was good, it proved to be, I'm very happy that we did the lockdown. Would that be proof that the lockdown was
because
right?
It's totally subjective.
But if they're giving their own subjective, I agree, they're giving their own subjective calculation of how it affected their life. And if you're basically asking all Queenslanders, do your own calculation of your life, and then we look at add it all up as we do in a survey, then that's sort of like a referendum on how it would perform. Would that get us somewhere to an answer?
No, I don't think it would, because, my impression is that people who weren't dramatically impacted, either financially or personally, are now saying, gee, that wasn't so bad, was it? And all the people who were adversely affected are saying, that was fucking terrible.
Yep.
And I don't think they're really going to change their minds. It's like the atomic bomb. Do you think, people have various opinions on whether dropping atomic bombs on Japan was a good idea. And there's no way to really go back and change history. And so people will make up their own minds on what they consider to be important. Some people will say, well, you should never use atomic weapons. Look, instantly, within minutes they killed, 70,000 people or something, and that was a crime against humanity. But the other side of the coin is people say, well, if they hadn't dropped the atomic bomb, it was calculated that, 100,000 or 200,000 American servicemen would have died trying to take control of Japan or whatever. So there are arguments on both sides, and it's a subjective opinion. So I don't think we can ever really have a clear result, if you know what I mean.
So there'll be no humble pie eating, because we'll never reach a point where we'll be able to say you were right or you were wrong.
No, I don't think we will.
Right.
To be honest.
I think you're right. I think I agree with you there.
We agree with each other on this. Good.
That we'll never be able to conclusively say. Although, I don't know, if a vaccine came out in 12 months' time and was really super effective and was duly administered and the population was basically free of COVID, it'd be a pretty good argument to say lockdown worked pretty well.
Yeah, but they would have been developing a vaccine even if lockdown hadn't been instituted. They would have been still trying to develop a vaccine. So
yes.
there'd be virtually no difference in the timeline of the development of the vaccine and the distribution. And, obviously I'm in favour of a vaccine, if it helps, terrific. I'm not anti-vax by any stretch of the imagination, but I still think that.
But one of the anti-lockdown arguments is that we need to get on with our lives.
Yes.
We need to.
Life is inherently risky.
We can't do this forever.
You can't make a totally safe society. And all this argument that, we're saving lives. Yes, you're saving some lives and you're sacrificing other lives. Which ones are more valuable?
I do think, if anything, this has pointed out how unfair our society is in that people are living on a knife edge and that there needs to be some form of government support that isn't, let's throw some temporary money at them, but, sod it. We don't need JobKeeper anymore, or we're going to cut it back down to tiny amounts.
And it will end. It will end.
Initially, one of the positives from it was a recognition by the government that people do end up in dire circumstances through no fault of their own, which was a recognition by the government. These people are in this position through hard-working Aussies who are in this position through no fault of their own. Here's some money. They're increasingly now turning to a view which is, well, if you haven't got a job by now, what's the matter with you? Come on, pull your finger out. You're clearly bludging now. If you haven't, we'll just
and you
start
can
reducing this.
The more conservative politicians will take that line.
Yeah, yeah. So
this time next year, they'll be all saying, what's wrong with you, bludgers? Why haven't you got back on your feet again? But as we know, some people have totally lost their business and their life savings, and some industries have been decimated. So, and they're not coming back anytime soon, some of them. So, it's very subjective. Those who were not terribly affected by it will congratulate the governments and say, job well done. And those who were disastrously affected will probably be bitter for the rest of their lives.
All right. Well, I don't know how long we've been going by the time we chop out the bits that what are we up to? What's the time here?
9:05.
All right. So we've probably been going. Well,
there was a question here about the eagerness to get a vaccine out and cutting safety corners.
Dylan Reid, was it?
Yeah, and I've certainly heard a big appeal. I know some of the pharmaceutical companies have said, I don't care what pressure, Mr. Government, you're putting on me. We're not cutting corners. We're going to do this. There are things we can do in parallel to speed up the process, but there are safety things that we will not cut corners on because the risk of it backfiring and giving ammunition to the anti-vaxxers is very, very high. So I think there's a lot of focus in the industry on making sure they're going to do it right first time.
They've got reputations to uphold.
Absolutely. So that,
and share prices to protect.
Well, not only share price, but they've got to keep vaccines relatively safe.
Of course.
So that you're not going to have a nutter saying, I'm not going to give my kid that vaccine.
Yeah, it's obviously not just about share price, but you can imagine if Pfizer distributed this and then later discovered there was some terrible problem with it, their share price would crash, wouldn't it? Surely.
It would.
I'm not saying it's only about share price, not at all.
Anyway, I'll be lining up for it if the relevant medical authorities say it's proven and all the rest of it. Put my faith in the science. Well, that was an awkward episode. That hiccup technically in the middle of it threw me anyway.
It's Russian hackers.
Yep, I think there's a plot against us. So good on you in the chat room if you came back for part 2. Thank you for all of your comments. And I don't know, I think next week I'm ready for some callers and some feedback. And if you've got a bone to pick with Paul or any of us, or you've got something, I reckon next week we're going to see what you can come up with in terms of conversations and complaints, or just ideas, preferably, or things that we haven't considered. So next week, get your Zoom apps ready, and we will look for some feedback and some talking with people as we go. Keep a look on the Facebook page. I might have a little rough agenda of some ideas, but if you've got some, let me know. And you're welcome to join us via Zoom next week, and I think we'll see what happens there. So, yeah, give that a go. You never know. A bit of a lucky dip, but we'll see. All right. Bye for now. See you next week.
And just before we go, a little shout out to Landon Hardbottom, who has just about finished his 14 days in quarantine returning to China. So congratulations, Landon. And it's about time you send us another message, don't you think?
Sure, you're stuck in a hotel room with,
Exactly.
with vengeance and retribution.
Vengeance and retribution, yes, exactly.
Eating chicken's feet.
Yeah.
He's chicken's feet. Cheryl's there too.
And
so.
Cheryl, yeah.
Good on you, Cheryl.
So
All right.
good luck, Landon. Hope that's going well for you.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, dokes. Thanks for tuning in. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.
Good night all.